whenever something's beat up this much, 90+%, I view it as a call option. It's a call option on a high growth industry for distressed companies. And I can't think of a better place to be.
Hello and welcome to Wealthion. I'm Maggie Lake, and joining me today is Chris Casey, founder and managing director of WindRock Wealth Management, to talk all things cannabis. Hey, Chris, it's great to be with you again.
Yeah, likewise, Maggie. Good to see you.
Cannabis is such an interesting sector. I'm really excited for this conversation because there was so much enthusiasm a few years ago and then so much disappointment. So why is it back on your radar?
Well, you're right. The enthusiasm primarily happened during the lockdowns when apparently everyone was stuck at home, unemployed, and just using cannabis because there was a big spike. If you look at all the stocks, there's a big hype about it. I'm looking at it right now because I think it's pretty rare where you're able to buy what effectively are distressed businesses in a high growth industry. And that's the way I look at it. And we've always been believers in contrarian investing, meaning you find a mispricing in the market, but then the key is identifying a catalyst that'll change that mispricing. And I think we have one here. I think there's a couple of things that could come down the pike that could really reverse the fortunes of some of these companies.
Yeah. So let's take a step back, though, because I definitely think there are going to be some people listening who probably haven't had exposure to cannabis. Maybe they weren't one of the people in lockdown who were, discovering it for the first time. But there was there was a swing, I think, in terms of kind of recognition, but certainly from an investment point of view. What happened that got so many people interested in sort of chasing those stocks? Why did so many companies pop up and stuff? I'm assuming it had something to do with legalization, but talk to me a little bit about the history before we jump into what's happening now.
Yeah, and it's appropriate to put in a historical context of what's happened in cannabis over the years. So obviously it's been illegal for some time, but not that long. I mean, like alcohol, it was prohibited for some time. But starting in the 1920s is when social appropriation, people were against it. 1937 Marijuana Tax Act effectively illegalized. And certainly in the 1970s, the Controlled Substances Act put it as a Schedule I drug, which is a fairly preposterous situation. That means it has no medical value, and it also means it's highly addictive. It's on there along with heroin, whereas things like cocaine and methamphetamine are Schedule II, right? Now, starting in 1996, that's when California first passed a medicinal legalization of marijuana. And it was followed up, it was by ballot. It was followed up in 2012, also by ballot with Colorado that approved recreational so anyone could use it, right? You don't have to prove some sort of medical reason. And since that time, we've had a number of state legislatures as well as ballots legalized in a number of different states. So we're currently at around 40 states that have legalized in some form, medicinal or otherwise. And about 24 of those states, including as well as DC, allow recreational use. So it's completely illegal. And what that means population-wise in the U.S. is that we have about, let's call it about 75% of the population has access to recreational cannabis, and over 50% has access, 75% has access to medicinal, and over 50% has access to recreational. So it's changed quite a bit over the years, but again, it still is considered illegal by the federal government. It is a Schedule I drug in the eyes of the DEA. And so therefore, it does present real difficulties for these companies in their operations.
So it's so interesting because, and that last line you said is really important because I think on a state level, it's been changing, right? And certainly from a societal point of view, I don't know, because of that or the states change as a result of it, you definitely see changes in attitude. I just was listening to some earnings reports from some of the big beer distributors, right? Some of the big beverage conglomerates, and their traditional sales are down. And one of the reasons cited by the analysts was that a lot of people have turned to cannabis because it's legal and it's more their preference. So, from a sort of consumer point of view, it certainly seems like it's changing. But what you just said is that's happening only at that level. On a federal level, it's still sort of criminalized and considered an illegal, dangerous drug.
That's correct. And yet it's still a pretty big industry, as you mentioned. And by the way, the social acceptance as well as the investment acceptance has grown quite a bit over the years. I mean, now you see, grandparents who have never thought about doing this, they're using THC type products on their elbow, for golf elbow or what have you. They're always looking for medicinal reasons. Let's put some numbers to it, though. It's a big industry. It's around, I believe, 30 billion in sales last year, in the United States. Put that in context. Canada, which is all legal, it had around 5 billion. But if you adjust it from a population perspective, it's probably about 40 billion in sales, equivalent to the US. Alcohol is over 100 billion. And tobacco is probably around 85 billion. So although it's only at 30 billion, there's a lot of room to grow. Some forecasts, I saw some articles, they put it at 2025 sales at anywhere from 35 to 45 billion. So there's a lot of growth that's expected in this industry.
If you have any questions about how to navigate the current environment, Wealthion can help connect you with a vetted advisor to get a free portfolio review. Just click the link in the description below or head to wealthion.com/free. There's no obligation and it will just take a few minutes of your time. Again, that's wealthion.com/free. So what are the companies that are participating? So are they public? Are they private? What is the nature of them? I think we've all seen the shops popping up everywhere. If you live in a state where it's legal, you've certainly probably seen that with your own eyes. But what is the nature of the companies that make up this sector?
Yeah, obviously it's both public and private. But as far as public companies, if you count the Canadian and American exchanges, there's probably 10 to 12 so-called cannabis companies of varying stages of so-called pure play, right? They may have other operations too, but of those 10 to 12, they tend to be fairly large, meaning they have operations in, let's call it 6 to 12 states. They may have several hundred retail centers. They probably have 24 grow centers where they're actually producing the product to sell into those retail locations. Valuation-wise, because everything's sold off quite a bit, they don't look that bad from kind of a high-level review. So price to sales valuations are somewhat reasonable. Most of them are below one-time sales. They have profitability at the gross profit margin, so the kind of the highest operating or profit margin you can look at. And their liquidity is not that bad either. There are solvency issues. There's negative cash flow issues. But in general, it's not a bad valuation from a valuation perspective or liquidity perspective, or from a gross operating perspective. It's not that bad as far as operationally.
So why what's the performance been like? I'm assuming, certainly from my perspective, I used to get tons of questions about this sector. There were a lot of people playing in it, a lot of retail playing in it, as well as a lot of institutional interest in it. And I used to get tons of questions. And it seems like so many people have just been, scared out of them. Or flushed out of them because it's been so difficult. So what does the performance look like? You just mentioned the potential for growth. So what's weighing them down? Like, what are some of the issues? What does the stock performance look like?
Well, as far as the stock performance, it's been atrocious. And this is why people don't look at it or even want to talk about it. And frequently, that's a good test is when you should be looking at investment, right? Where no one wants to hear about it. And that's what we have right now with cannabis. I mean, cannabis, since let's call it the lockdown period when they had not necessarily all-time highs, but they did quite well, they're off since then, or from their all-time highs, let's call it on average, probably 80, 90+%. So it's real devastation. And a lot of that's happened over the last 12 months. Over the last 12 months, you'll see returns that make up the bulk of that, where they're down 70, 80%. So it's really been a horrible industry. Stock performance, the industry itself is hamstrung by three key factors. And hopefully these are resolved, which is where I think the opportunity is. One, I could go into each of these in detail, but one is that they have a burdensome tax regime that they operate under. So effectively, right now, according to Section 280E of the IRS code, these companies are only allowed, ironically, to deduct inventory. So they can deduct what's illegal, supposedly, but they can't deduct what's legal, meaning payroll, rent, utilities, that kind of stuff. So they're getting effectively taxed at their gross margins, which is effectively horrible tax rate for all these companies, right? So that's one big impediment. Two would be they're not able to operate across state lines. I mean, think about that for a second. What other industry could survive and yet not be able to operate across state lines? I can only think of historically a couple. One was banking. And it was to banking's detriment, right? The 27 McFadden Act prevented banks from having branches in other states, in which case it caused portfolio concentration. So like in Illinois, if you're a bank operating under that law, you would be exposed, have heavy exposure to farmland and manufacturing. You couldn't branch out across state lines. So that is a big impediment. Now, when that changes eventually, there's some amazing things that are going to happen. It's not just efficiency. So right now, yes, there'll be efficiencies where they can have one growth center servicing maybe 5 state plus states. But more importantly, it changes the nature of their production and distribution, right? Think of how many different industries in agriculture grow something in a greenhouse, right? Maybe flowers, and a lot of those are imported, I believe, from Colombia. So what other industry really has that? It's a terribly inefficient way to grow things. Eventually, Kentucky and Virginia should have fields of cannabis instead of fields of tobacco. They'll be the low-cost providers eventually. It also changes, you'll have online distribution. And that sounds shocking now. Like, how could you allow cannabis to be going across state lines, being delivered from an online purchase? Well, that already exists, actually. It exists because of the 2018 Farm Act, where as long as it's derived from hemp, you can do that. Again, that's inefficient because hemp doesn't have a lot of THC. So there's a lot of great factors that can happen from being able to operate across state lines. On top of that, the third big impediment for them is the access to capital. As you know, any growing industry needs capital. They need capital for working capital requirements, and they need money for capital expenditures, right, to expand their operations. They're either A, locked out of capital right now, or B, the terms are fairly onerous. So I did like a survey of like all the announced debt deals for public companies. It's not uncommon to see them at 10+% in interest. And that's just the basic terms. Who knows what other covenants they have, how restrictive they are. Who knows if there's an equity kicker? I don't know. But it's so bad right now that banking industry, they may have access to a credit union. They may have access to a regional bank. However, if you're looking at a nationally chartered bank, the problem is that these banks won't lend to you. They won't even lend to real estate companies if they have a tenant that's in the cannabis space. So it really is a huge burden. And again, the very fact that this industry exists, the very fact that it's at 30 billion in sales is a testament to its resilience and the potential of the industry.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking about. And the banking part of it, the inability to bank basically as a business, I know is what a lot of people have been thinking about as the holy grail. If you can change that as the big sort of road bump. But you just mentioned two other really important ones. But as I listen to you, I'm thinking, how have they been able to survive? I mean, it sounds like it's almost impossible to function at any kind of scale given those challenges.
And that's why it's severely detrimental to growing the business. It's severely detrimental just to profitability. And that's why, as you mentioned earlier, investors are just turned off and they really haven't looked at it. But I think they should re-examine it because I think there's some things coming down the pike that could change that dramatically.
Yeah. So but by the way, talk about battle tested. I mean, if they've survived now, they're coming from, such a, as you say, such a sort of resilient posture that seems attractive, even in downturns in the future. I mean, if this is what they've had to deal with, but what do you think's about to change? Why now do you think that something is going to sort of help clear away some of this?
Yeah. And by the way, when things do change, that's not to say they won't still have their problems, because you can anticipate, like they had in Canada, plunging cannabis prices, right? Which, if you're a high cost operator, may be difficult to operate in, and other things like that. Firms that aren't well branded, that's key too. As far as what changed, there's basically two potential changes I think are on the horizon. One is rescheduling. Now, in, I believe, October of 2022, the Biden administration charged the DEA and the Department of Homeland Security with examining or considering rescheduling cannabis, which is kind of a preposterous idea. It's kind of like, because these are vested interests in keeping it illegal, right? It's no different than if you had put the ATF in charge of firearms deregulation, right? It's never going to happen, right? So what happened is that everything is stalled. There is a process that's outlined to reschedule drugs. They've started the process, but the latest, it's basically suspended right now. The latest development was they're supposed to have a hearing back in January. They never had it. I don't know when they will have it. So things have bogged down. However, as you probably would agree with this current president, at any given moment, you could get a 3 a.m. Truth Social text that says, as of now, Donald J. Trump, I've ordered the Department, the DEA to reschedule this immediately, which would be great. But again, because it doesn't comport with the facts, how it's currently rescheduled. However, if they do reschedule it, frankly, it should not be on the schedule at all. But if they do reschedule it, I don't want to see them move it to like Schedule 2 or 3. They really need to bump it down quite a bit. Now,
Yeah,
the
because that
other,
will only change at the margin. So just so we're clear, we were referencing this before. The scheduling refers to what it's classified as in terms of drugs. So right now it's in a schedule or in a classification with extremely dangerous drugs like heroin. It's sort of at the top of the heap. Advocates would like to see it pulled all the way down to something much more sort of medicinal in nature, sort of take it out of the sort of criminal realm and put it schedule it differently, right?
absolutely. And I think, and basically the facts line up with the fact that it absolutely should be rescheduled, regardless what you feel. And this is not a commentary on the drug war. It's not a commentary on
Right.
drug use or anything like that. But the facts are it has medicinal qualities, and it's far less, if it is addictive at all, which most people would say it's not, it's far less addictive than these other drugs. Certainly, I would imagine if cocaine and methamphetamine are Schedule 2, you got to go below that, right? It's got to be scheduled.
Right. So just to be clear, it's scheduled higher than them.
It is.
Right
It's
now.
considered worse in the eyes of the federal government than those two drugs, along with,
But
along
you
with
touched
heroin.
on something really interesting. I just want to stay here for one moment because this is where I think part of why it's stalled is because the conversation isn't just from a sort of scientific point of view. It's not just from an investment point of view or a tax revenue point of view, which, by the way, a lot of states would like to see the tax revenue, come in from this. It's very caught up in cultural and policing and there are all these other threads in there, right? All the people who are in jail because of possession of marijuana, if you suddenly reschedule it, do you have to retry all? There's a big knock-on effect that's politicized to this conversation, I think, which is part of why there is a delay. Does it seem like there's momentum to resolve that? And again, we're not saying what's right. We're just talking about the sort of particulars of this, if you're trying to think of it from an investment point of view. Do you feel there's some momentum, Chris?
I'd say there's not momentum per se. And you're right. There's a ton of vested interests, and it's basically a quagmire of a process, right? So they solicit opinions on all these different special interest groups, and they got to wait for that. It'll be another year. So it is kind of a quagmire. That's why I think the current administration is key, because as we know, Trump will go off on his own and do things he wants to do. He also will do things that kind of avoid the systemic procedures that are in place. I could easily see him arguing
the bureaucracy. So
let's get this done now. I could see that happening.
Mm.
The other item now, whether or not that happens, there is also some relief for cannabis companies from a legislative perspective from Congress. And so right now, there's what they call the SAFER Act. SAFER Act is the newest iteration of some cannabis laws, previously known as the SAFE Act. It's in the Senate. Basically, the SAFER Act gives immunity to banks, and so they can deal with cannabis companies if they so choose. Now, that did get out of committee back in 2023. However, nothing's really developed, has yet to hit the floor. But again, that's something I could see Trump working with congressional leadership and arguing that needs to be changed right now. Now, we should temper these thoughts with the fact that we all thought Biden was going to do something as well, right? But I think right now we have a general consensus from both aisles of Congress that something should be done. So hopefully we start seeing some movement on both those fronts.
And as you point out, we have precedent here because I just was going over some of the details of the Genius Act and some of the changes that are being suggested from the SEC around digital assets, and they're much more far-reaching and than some thought. So they seem to sort of be moving fast, clearing the way, moving out some of the agenda of this sort of change much more quickly than anyone who watches Washington would have thought. So there is a precedent sort of for moving fast and sort of, correcting course in a way, and resolving some of these long-standing tensions. It's on the flip side of all the challenges. I mean, again, I come back to that line you said before that 40-something states have now legalized this. So from a state versus federal perspective, it's sort of on the ground already happening. Does that mean that it maybe is easier now in a way that it wasn't some years ago when you didn't have so many states lined up on the same side of this issue?
Absolutely. I mean, now you're at the point where the federal government would be acknowledging a fact versus pushing through an agenda, right? This is the way it is. Like I said before, 75% of Americans have access to cannabis. So that's an existing fact. So it's kind of silly in a way for them to keep pushing these agendas where you can't operate across state lines, where they supposedly there's no medicinal value. That's going to change, I think. Whether it's this year or later on, I don't know, but the potential, everything's probabilities, right? And the probability, I'd say, is pretty high something happens in the next year or so.
So this brings me to a really good question, which is time frame. So you're very much looking at it early because we haven't seen the news. It will be priced in before it actually happens, right? And we, haven't really seen these stocks moving. So time frame wise, this sounds like not a 6-month investment, but a longer term bet that we're on the cusp of something happening.
Potentially, it's hard to say. My personal point of view, when anything is beaten up as bad as these stocks are,
Mm.
if they're not, unless there's a going concern aspect to it, I mean, I would strongly consider companies that are market leaders. You can't really use a Graham Dodd type security analysis on these companies because although they have some decent operations and financial metrics at the high end, ultimately they're mostly negative cash flow, right? So that's not going to work. So you want to buy market leaders and stuff. And again, it could be 2 years from now, but it could be overnight. I mean, Trump could do this, and he's talked about it on the campaign trail, and things can change very, very quickly. So whenever something's beat up this much, 90+%, I view it as a call option. It's a call option on a high growth industry for distressed companies. And I can't think of a better place to be.
Interesting. You just brought up a really good point about, so there's the thought as you say that, I'm sure people are thinking, wow, if we see a change like this for this kind of beat up company, you could see some really big gains on the back of that. We've seen what happens when you clear hurdles like this, but that doesn't necessarily mean an all clear, because then it's sort of the everyday business challenges you have, especially with a rapidly changing sector or industry. And you just mentioned something like you have to be branding. You have to think about those kinds of things that maybe these companies haven't had to do, right?
That's true. I mean, they could be largely, small markets are highly regulated where you have barriers to entry, et cetera. They haven't had to. I remember touring, for investment purposes, touring a growth center and a retail shop in Colorado, probably in like 2000, it's called 16 or so. So about 4 years after it was recreationally legal in Colorado. And you could tell back then, no one here has ever worked at a retail shop because the spacing was horrible. It looked like, like a 1950s Bulgarian, store where there's nothing on the shelves. The displays were terrible. Like no one had any idea what they're doing. That's changed.
Yeah.
Quite a bit. So yeah, there are different challenges once it becomes legal, a whole host of different challenges, which is why you got to look at the industry as a whole, not necessarily try to pick one or two winners, because that landscape will be vastly different once things are either we have the SAFER Act passed or we have true rescheduling or meaningful rescheduling.
Do you see a lot of consolidation immediately if that were to happen, since it sounds like the system created all these small players because of the barriers of going across state lines, et cetera? Do you think that in addition to the kind of rapid changes, that there'd be a lot of consolidation, maybe another reason to watch out on individual names as opposed to sort of an ETF that follows the sector?
Yeah, I could definitely see some consolidation because what you can see happening is that if these events happen, if these catalysts are implemented, and if the landscape changes, it's much more beneficial for these companies. Well, I would expect the stock prices to pop. And just to put some perspective to it, if these stock prices even got to their 52-week highs from where they sit today, you're looking at, depending on the stock, probably 2 to 6 times return on your money. That's how dramatically they have fallen recently, right? So yes, once if these catalysts were implemented, if all of a sudden their stock prices popped, now they got some money they can play with, right? Now they have share prices they can use to buy some private companies. So I wouldn't be surprised if there's a massive consolidation that happens. That's not to say there's not going to be plenty of startups, but you're going to have also legitimate companies go into it. We've already seen that with tobacco. We've already seen that with alcohol. They've already had some true investments over the years, but I'm sure they will jump in. And it's only a matter of time before those cigarette companies, like I said, if you've ever driven through Kentucky or Virginia, those fields are going to look very different in a couple of years.
Wild. And that was, I mentioned before, without thinking about it, the fact that the beverages have seen a decline. So tobacco is one, but you could see other sort of companies in that space. So there might be more than one way to play this, I suppose. Have you heard about any any of the sort of beverage companies thinking about going like that? Because they're putting TCH in beverages. That's another sector that did well as traditional beer consumption declined.
Yeah, not just that. Yes, I do certainly see that. But think of all the medicinal, like I mentioned earlier, someone using a transdermal topical agent, for muscle soreness or something like that. I think that's going to be very common. You're going to have doctors that will start, they're not recommending anything like this right now. Maybe under a table, like, hey, go get yourself some of this.
Yeah.
We've seen it do wonders for other people in this condition. It's going to start happening. It's going to happen quite a bit.
Amazing. So fascinating and so great to have this kind of conversation so early on. What do you think? Do you think the average investor is exposed to this? Like, what do you think? Who owns these stocks now, if anybody? What do you think typical exposure is? I'm guessing not very high, right?
Well, it's not very high for a couple of reasons. One, I can't imagine a registered investment advisor like we are, besides us. I don't know how many are really out there telling their clients to consider cannabis. Probably not many. Secondly, for retail investors, you can't necessarily buy it. So, for instance, I have a friend. I just mentioned, hey, we're investing X number of stocks. This is what we're buying in the cannabis industry. And he's like, I can't buy it from my custodian. They won't let me buy it. It has nothing to do with the type of account he has or the amount of money it's in there. They just have a blanket ban on it. So a lot of retail investors have not invested in it. And then third, the ones that have were probably in it years ago because they really liked the story. The story was the exact same back then, but for the fact that I think the likelihood of these catalysts being implemented are stronger now. And if they were in there, as everyone knows, that's ever been in a stock that goes down 90%, it's the last thing you want to talk about, right? No one wants to hear anything about cannabis if you lost 90% of your money. No one wants to hear anything about it. No one's going to double down. It's just human nature.
Yeah. Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Well, it sounds like it is something that we all ought to be thinking about or at least have on our radar. So we appreciate you bringing it to our attention, Chris. Fantastic stuff.
Well, thank you, Maggie.
As always, if this is something you're thinking about, or you want to check in on your finances, you can head over to wealthion.com/free and connect with one of our advisors in the network who will do a free portfolio review for you. Chris, fantastic stuff. I look forward to the next one. Thank you so much.
You got it. Thanks.